Hi, I'm Rebecca Weaver-Hum, the Music and Arts Director here at the Hornell Area Family YMCA, and I am a huge fan of sewing projects that I can do with what I call right sides together, so turn right side out, top stitch closed. Love them. From double-sided placemats to baby birth cloths to double-sided towels, anything you can think of. If you can put right sides together and stitch it together and turn it, it's an easy way to do a great finish. But sometimes I get interested in doing something a little bit different. And sometimes I'm interested in a project that's maybe a little bit more special. So that's what I'm doing today. I've already shown you how I make baby burp cloths and washcloths and baby blankets out of two sides of fabric that I put together and stitch and turn right side out and top stitch. Today's project is a self-mitering border, self-bordering, however you want to call it, baby blanket that has two different layers to it. This one has a solid layer for the front a solid layer for the back and a print layer for the front. And the back fabric effectively wraps over and then forms these neat little mitered corners at the edge. It's not difficult to do. There is one step that's a little bit tricky, but I'll show you how to get through it from beginning to end. So the first step is to pick out your fabrics and then cut two squares of them, one of them bigger than the other. The first step to making our self-mitered baby blanket is to cut the two pieces of fabric. I have an inner piece here and an outer piece, and they both have to be square, and one simply has to be bigger than another. Now, if you look up lots of different ways of doing this, you'll see a lot of patterns suggest that you make the difference in the sizes closer to 10 inches. That way you have 5 inches on either side. That is the difference between the two fabrics, and you'll end up with overall about a 2.5 inch or slightly less 2-inch border. Now, I personally, because I'm cutting this based on what I've got available, and the gray flannel isn't super wide, have a much, much narrower size, as you can see. So when this is done, I'm going to have a very thin border on each side, but that doesn't really bother me any. So after you cut your two square pieces, you lay them out right sides together, but you lay them out so that you have one side together. I usually think of this as doing the top side first. So right sides together means my little image, my little bear's heads are pointing up here, and I put the two so that the center point of each is together. I'll mark this with a pin, or in this case, I've left it folded up long enough so that the creases are pretty apparent where the center is, and that makes it quite straightforward. So now I'm going to pin the two pieces of fabric together, starting at the center and working out, because the most important thing here, honestly, is to keep my centers together. And you don't have to put in huge amounts of pins. I'm probably just going to put in 3 on each side, going down pretty much to the corner on this top side. I'm sorry I don't have a wider camera angle for this, but this is what I've got. So now you can see that it's pinned all the way around. So from here, I'm going to turn the whole thing around this way and do the other side. Now you may be realizing at this point that the top fabric, or the front fabric of the blanket when it's done, in this case my printed fabric, is much shorter than the other. So as you're pinning this together, you will end up with quite a bit of excess inside from the outer piece of fabric. So the plain gray fabric will have excess that's just kind of hanging out. So don't expect to be able to make these two smooth, because they're just not the same size. But I do the same thing on what's going to be the bottom of my blanket. Pin it along from the center out, just smoothing the edges so that they're nice and together. Okay, put a couple pins seams in this other side. And now I have my top and bottom pinned together. And on both sides, you can see that I have this excess. Now we do the two sides the same way. So I turn it to one side, and I flop it in place. And pin. Again, from the center, line up those centers, and go up from there. It will get increasingly weird to try to lay it out, just because now as we're bringing together 4 corners where one blanket is bigger than the other and we're matching up the edges, it's just going to feel a little bit weird. So you may not find it easy to just completely lay it flat and pin it, and you just kind of pin as you go in midair like I'm doing, I guess I would say. Okay. So after I do this side, then I turn it one more time and do the 4th side. And after I have all 4 sides pinned together, it's time to sew. There are a lot of different ways to handle this. You can, if you want to be absolutely certain, if you have any concerns about your fabric stretching as you sew it, then you're going to want to start at the center pin of each side and sew to the edge. Sew over to the corner, I should say. You're going to basically sew to the end of the smaller fabric that's going to be the top side of the blanket. In this case, my print. If your fabric isn't going to stretch very much, then you don't have to worry about that. You can just sew all the way along from edge to edge. And the other thing that you can do is you can do this in one whole seam all the way around. Mark a little dot about 1/4 of an inch from your corner. And if you mark a dot there, then that's where you sew to and turn. So you'll sew all the way around to about 1/4 inch from this corner, turn and come down, and that way you can do the whole thing in one continuous seam instead of 4 seams. In my case, just because I don't feel so confident and I don't make enough of these to feel really confident in it, I always do it starting and stopping in 4 seams. I go edge to edge, but I don't try to turn it because I'm always a little bit worried that I'm going to goof and catch my fabric under here. So that's going to be my next step. You might find that a walking foot, especially if you're working with a fabric that's stretchy or thick pile, like if you do this in minky or one of those soft synthetic fabrics, you may find that you do better with a walking foot. Since I'm just doing cotton flannel, that's not going to be a problem for me. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this, and then I'll be back to show the next step. So now you can see that I've sewn across where I marked those seams and pulled the pins. And before you go ahead and cut off the corners, there's an easy way to check to make sure that you've done it correctly. And that's simply to open out your blanket, so you kind of get a sneak peek of what it's going to look like, frankly, and open it out so that your outside is kind of making its border, just like that. And if your flaps will fold over, then you're in business. You have cut it, or you've sewn it correctly, and you can go ahead and cut off this excess without worrying about it. So now, this is always the part that makes me nervous, I have to say, and so giving myself a chance to double check makes me much more comfortable. So I'm going to go around the blanket, cut off the excess on those 4 corners, and then the last step is to turn this right side out through the opening that we've left for it, and then top stitch it in place. So if I find my opening over here, couldn't be simpler. You just reach in, and I usually go in to sort of find the far corner and start pulling through. Sometimes that is a little self-defeating because I get too much fabric at once. So as you go, pull kind of gently so that you don't pull your seam. But if you stopped and started your seam around the place where you've opened it for turning, you'll be all right. And then you just kind of keep tugging it through until it's all right side out. This part always seems a little overly dramatic to me. Like, you struggle and struggle and struggle. Whoop, you pull your seam a little bit. That was not part of the plan. It'll be okay though. And then finally, you get to the point where it seems like most of it's turned through and you're in business. There we go. Now, I obviously didn't do a good enough job backstitching and I tried to pull too much fabric through at once. Oh well. Okay. So now, when you go to the corners of your blanket and you push them out, you'll see we have these gorgeous mitered corners that will just set off the whole blanket perfectly. The last step for this is to top stitch around the edge. You can do a complete, what they call stitch in the ditch, where you literally sew in the seam, or you can sew just to the inside of the inner piece. I usually fold the seam allowance to one side for these, and I fold them toward the inside. That's just how I do it. But then I will go ahead and sew through the whole thing. And the advantage to that, of course, is it sews your opening completely closed so that you won't see that opening at all. So that's the last step.